Hey there, music people. Welcome back to the channel. This is Raised by Hippies, and this is my series on women in the history of music. In this video today, we're going to be getting into the tragic life and death of early 60s country music pioneer and all-around baddie, Patsy Cline. Patsy Cline was one of the original loud-mouthed women to push down the walls that the male-dominated industry put up in front of her. And although her career was extremely short due to her untimely death at the age of 30 years old, she had a lasting impact on the industry. Patsy Cline was born Virginia Patterson Hensley in September 1932 in Winchester, Virginia. The beginning of her story is very dark and very devastating. It was approaching the height of the Depression era, and Sam Hensley was a 43-year-old alcoholic widower who worked as a blacksmith, and he'd just gotten 15-year-old Hilda Patterson pregnant and was marrying her in a shotgun wedding. He already had 2 children from a previous marriage whose mother had passed away recently. Those 2 children were living in foster care. It was the Depression. Life was hard. Hilda worked her fingers to the bone to keep her family fed, but Sam's heavy drinking and abusive behavior kept them in severe poverty. When Virginia was a child, everyone called her Ginny. She and her mother were extremely close, and they tried to cope with their situation the best they could. Imagine these 2 young girls, only 16 years apart in age, living with this disgusting drunk of a 50-something-year-old man. It was the 30s. Women couldn't just leave their husbands, even when, as she would later confide in her good friend Loretta Lynn, Sam started sexually abusing Patsy, a fact that was later confirmed by her mother Hilda when they were doing the research for the film Sweet Dreams about the life of Patsy Cline. For years, they moved a dozen times due to Sam's transient work situation. They'd find a dilapidated, abandoned old farmhouse, move in, and live there until they couldn't anymore, and then they would move into the next one. Right when the Second World War was coming to an end, Ginny was only 13 years old. She developed an infection in her throat, which caused her to be hospitalized for some time. It was said that her heart stopped at one point, and doctors provided what at the time was considered a miracle treatment with an oxygen tent. By the time she'd recovered, the treatment on her throat had caused her to have this booming, loud voice. It wasn't long before she became interested in singing, realizing that she also had perfect pitch. Within a year, she was looking to audition for the local radio station, so she walked downtown and right into the waiting room of WYNC Winchester and asked them if she could audition. The disc jockey was so impressed that he immediately gave her a spot on the show. Around the same time in 1947, her father Sam finally took off, which likely came as more of a relief to her mother than a heartbreak. Ginny and Hilda became extremely close, acting a lot more like sisters than mother and daughter. Education was basically non-existent for Ginny and her siblings. She dropped out of school in the 9th grade to get a job. Ginny helped support the family with whatever job that she could get. She started doing things like poultry processing and cleaning the bus station. Following year, at 15 years old, Ginny wrote a letter to the Grand Ole Opry, the legendary country music venue in Nashville, Tennessee, begging them for an audition. They showed little interest in her at the time, but she knew how to take her opportunities when they came. It's important to note that during this time, women didn't really do country music. If they did, they were part of a male singer's band, certainly never as their own solo act. This was the late 1940s, a very backward time in the history of the progress of women. The end of the war saw the return of 4 million soldiers to the United States, where they took back their old jobs and expected their wives to be standing in the kitchen waiting for them. It was hard, but Ginny Hensley was determined. In 1952, at 19 years old, Ginny met band leader Bill Peer and auditioned for him successfully, joining his group of backup singers. It wasn't long before she started sleeping with him. He was, of course, married at the time, but it was well known that he had affairs with all of his singers. For whatever reason, he didn't think the name Virginia suited a country singer, so he had her change her name to Patsy as an ode to her middle name, which was actually her mother's maiden name, Patterson. Soon enough, it became known that she was having an affair with a married man, and her reputation in the town went down the drain. Not only was she the rough-edged country singer girl from the wrong side of the tracks, but now she was an accomplice to infidelity. To remedy this, in 1953, when she met Gerald Cline, a quiet man from a well-off family, she quickly married him. It wasn't long, though, before Patsy returned to her affair with Bill Peer, now both of them being married to other people. The marriage was doomed right from the start. They had different goals and different approaches towards life. Patsy was determined to get famous in Nashville. Gerald later spoke about it in an interview and said that it was always her way or the highway, and that it just wasn't fair to him. And so Patsy agreed, and later said that at this point during her life, she just didn't know anything about love. Meanwhile, beginning in 1953, Bill Peer really started to push for her to get a record contract. He made a demo of her singing, and finally, in 1954, at 21 years old, after years of trying, Patsy Cline got her first record contract with 4 Star Records. Unfortunately, it was very common in these days for contracts to be bad, and for artists to be taken advantage of by their labels. Patsy's was no exception. Anything she recorded would be owned by 4 Star, star, and she had to sing whatever they wanted her to sing. Furthermore, she would only receive a very small amount of the profits. In 1954, Patsy Cline recorded her first set of songs for 4-Star Records, and none of them really made any waves on the country charts. About a year later, Decca would become the parent company of 4-Star and a lot of their artists, and started to put a lot of pressure on Patsy to make a hit record. A songwriter who was brought in to help suggested the bluesy song Walkin' After Midnight, a song that Patsy didn't even like initially, but recorded anyway just to please the label. In April 1956, while still married to Gerald, she met Charlie Dick, who was working for the local newspaper. They met at one of the shows that Patsy was working on with Bill Peer, and Charlie asked her to dance. The two hit it off immediately. Patsy finally finished things permanently with Bill Peer and set off to divorce her husband, which she did in early 1957. Mere months later, she and Charlie would be married. Right around the same time that she was divorcing Gerald Cline, Patsy got her big break when she sang Walkin' After Midnight on a show that was pretty similar to something like America's Got Talent, called Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts. The label released the song as a single at the same time, and bam, Patsy had a hit. And finally, she was invited to sing at the Grand Ole Opry in February 1957. It's estimated that the 45 for Walkin' After Midnight sold over 250,000 records, which is pretty amazing for the 1950s. In 1958, Patsy became a mother when her daughter Julie was born. Both she and Charlie were super excited about this because when she'd been with Gerald, she'd had a miscarriage, was afraid that she wouldn't be able to have children. Julie was a miracle baby, but as much as Patsy loved motherhood, the rat race was calling. She recorded I Fall to Pieces in late 1960 and had her first #1 hit on the country music charts in America. Patsy was becoming a huge star at this point and was making waves in the media for being a woman who didn't let men in her industry walk all over her. She wore pantsuits on stage, most of which her mother had actually sewn for her. She was iconic as a strong woman with a strong voice at a time when women were just waking up to their rights. Meanwhile, her relationship with her second husband, Charlie Dick, although passionate and full of love, was also volatile. The pair became known as hard drinkers who often got into heated arguments. In 1961, when her family was visiting her in Nashville, Patsy and her brother got into a very serious car accident when another vehicle hit them head-on. Patsy was thrown through the windshield and suffered a variety of very serious injuries, including a huge gash across her face which just missed her eyes. She had a broken wrist and a dislocated hip, but when the ambulance arrived and ran right over to her, she told them to go see the other people in the other car first. Her injuries at the time were considered life-threatening, but miraculously she made a full recovery. In August 1961, she was back in the studio and recorded a bunch of songs including Wayward Wind and San Antonio Rose, as well as one song written by an up-and-coming country singer and songwriter called Willie Nelson. The song was called Crazy, and just like Walking After Midnight, it was another song that Patsy didn't like. Still recovering from her accident, it became painful for her to hit those high notes. But despite all this, her stunning version of the song would be released and reach #2 on the American country charts, becoming her most recognizable hit. Right around the same time, her son Randy was born. By 1962, Patsy was on top. She'd played all the biggest venues in North America, and she had a string of hit songs and was finally financially stable enough to afford a house, which was a huge step for her. Patsy had gained a lot of friends because of her huge personality, people like Loretta Lynn, Brenda Lee, and June Carter. Near the end of her life, she started to tell people like this that she started to feel an impending doom and that she may not actually live that much longer. So it's March 1963, and Patsy's playing a benefit in Kansas City for the family of a disc jockey who'd recently been killed in a car accident. After the show, it was foggy and cold, but Patsy and her group had to get back to Nashville. Friends offered her a ride for the almost 16-hour drive back to Tennessee, but Patsy declined. She would take the plane with the other country singers, Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins, and pilot Randy Hughes, who she also happened to be having an affair with during that time. They even came to a stop at one point because of the bad weather, but right back up into the sky they went, despite all of the warnings that everyone had given them. The plane crashed not far from Nashville, near Camden, Tennessee. All the passengers on board were immediately killed. The wristwatch that Patsy had been wearing read 6:20 p.m. when it was recovered, and so ended the life of Patsy Cline at just 30 years old. It's estimated that over 25,000 people attended her funeral back in Winchester, Virginia, where she was buried. Her grave simply reads Virginia Dick, 1933 to 1963. Patsy Cline was an extraordinary woman. She took no shit from anyone. She loved hard and lived hard and pushed her way into an industry that didn't want her there. In the 1950s, most women were at home making dinner for their families. Patsy Cline was out being a straight badass. And it's hard to think of what she might have done with her life had she not decided to get on that plane. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.